set?
Sure.
All right. So, hi everybody. Nice that there's snow outside and 100 degrees below zero when we're talking about baseball, right? So yeah, welcome. Tonight, our speaker is Mitch Lutzke. He's a Michigan native, an award-winning radio reporter, high school teacher and coach, as well as a historical writer, and his various publications, including the Society of American Baseball Research. In the past month, this is pretty exciting. The past month, he was named. This book was named as one of the 2018 Michigan Notable Books by the Library of Michigan. That's huge. Also, the Society of American Baseball Research, also known as SABR, has recently awarded Mitch the Robert Peterson Recognition Award from the Jerry Malloy Negro Baseball Committee for his work, or his book on the Giants. So you don't want to listen to me, you want to listen to him. So without further ado, please welcome Mitch Lutzke.
Thank you for coming out tonight. I'm a high school history teacher, and I'm a high school track and field coach. So I can put up with people falling asleep on me and just won't miss a beat. And I can talk for 5 hours. We won't go for 5 hours, but there'll be question and answer at the end. And my book will be for sale in the back as well. This team did play in Kalamazoo, so I'm going to add some local flavor to the book as well. And I'm just going to basically say, how did I stumble upon this book? This book is the only book ever written on the Page Fence Giants. They were a barnstorming black baseball team that operated from 1895 to 1898, based in Adrian, Michigan. They won the World Black Baseball or Colored Baseball Championship in 1896, and they eventually disbanded and moved to Chicago in 1899. Many of the ball players were probably of major league caliber, but because of the racial divide in the country, by the time that these gentlemen were playing ball, some on integrated teams, they were not going to be allowed to be playing in Major League Baseball, though they did play professionally minor leagues, and these were all professional ball players. The story of the team, and this is a team, this is probably the 1896 championship photo, and Page was the name of a fence company in Adrian, which I'll go into in a minute. This is Gus Parsons, who was their business manager of the team and did all of the booking for the team, and he was well known in Adrian because he was a clerk at the local Hotel Emory and had run a gambling bookie making place in the 1880s and had been arrested, so people knew who he was. Some of these ball players we know, some of them we don't know. That was one of the hurdles, which I'll speak about. But this is Grant Home Run Johnson, Charlie Grant, that's probably Joe Miller, James Patterson, and then we've got, I think that's George Wilson, this is Bill Binga, George Taylor, maybe James Chavis, Pete Burns, maybe Vasco Graham, we're not sure. This picture was auctioned off for almost $9,000 a couple of years ago by Sotheby's without the identification of the year or the player. So just me kind of researching it, I've pretty much identified most of those ball players as best we can. Okay, let me see. So this is the Findlay, Ohio team, and this is Bud Fowler, and this is Grant Home Run Johnson. And I'll get back to those two gentlemen in a minute, but they're part of the co-ownership. The ownership was an interracial ownership. There were 3 white owners and 2 black owners of the Page Fence Giants for the first few months of the season. But how did I stumble upon this? Well, this is my 3rd book. My first one was about a great-great-grandfather who had fought in the Civil War, and it had 1,800 footnotes and 100 sources, and everybody in my family said they were going to buy it, and they didn't. So I thought, okay, I will do another book, and I'm a local volunteer for our Williamston Depot Museum in town, and I was getting phone calls because I would write articles for the newspaper about historical spots in Williamston, which is about 17 miles east of Lansing, East Lansing, and I decided to write a book to dispel some of the rumors of what's allegedly happened in town. It actually didn't happen in town, and then I set up an endowment fund for the local museum. Well, during this book writing in 2014, I had discovered that in 1895, that was a hugely popular year for baseball, professional baseball in Michigan. The Detroit Tigers in Major League did not exist until 1901. So Major League Baseball was really big, and Grand Rapids was actually seen as a more prominent town than Detroit, believe it or not, for baseball, the future of baseball. Well, in 1895, Kalamazoo had a team. They were known as the Zulus and the Celery Eaters and some other creative team name. But in 1895, I'm researching Williamston, and they don't have a professional team, but they got a bunch of local guys, and they play at a town called Mason. And apparently, they hate each other, because the newspaper articles from the 1890s are these just glowing praises of the honesty and the gentlemanly play of the local boys, and the other team were clowns and hoodlums. Mason actually said that Williamston had more drunks per capita than any place in the world. So you can see sportsmanship was not big in the 1890s, and in this case 1895. Well, Williamston decided to build some stadium, and we really don't know where it is. I kind of have an idea where it might be. And the idea was the Williamston Baseball Association was luring in minor league teams. Lansing had a team called the Senators, and any traveling team, groups of farmers, whatever, and then charge admission. Well, I had come across a note that said in 1895, the Williamston Baseball Association is going to try to get the famous Page Fence Giants to play in Williamston. They'll be a great draw. I had never heard of this team and didn't think much about it, but I put on a little sticky note, and then I discovered that it was an all-black team, and I really didn't know anything about it, so I just put like black team, and I put it in a file for baseball. I wrote the chapter called like Baseball 1895 and sold the book, and kind of didn't really think much about it. About 6 months later, I was getting stir crazy, and I went through my files to see for another possible book topic, and there was 3 or 4 on my short list, and the Page Fence Giants was one, so I did everything I tell my kids don't do. Don't Google, then go to Wikipedia, but I did. And there was almost nothing on this team. And they were from Adrian, Michigan, and they were really good. They had some players, and I was familiar with maybe one of the players, maybe 2. I'm like, okay, so I said, well, maybe these guys need a book. So I called the Adrian, the Lenawee County Historical Museum. And I'm thinking, and by this time, I kind of learned that they were a really good team, and I wrote to everybody blindly on email who were experts on black baseball in the country, just to say, hey, is somebody doing this project? Does this group need a book? Is this like a waste of my time? Because I'm not really an expert on black baseball. I played baseball in high school, and I watched a lot of baseball sitting on the bench, but I didn't play much the year I played. So I didn't really know if this was something that was already known by niche baseball people, and I was just out of the loop or whatever. And I got a lot of positive responses. All were like, yes, these guys need a book. They were champions, and nobody's written a book on them. So I'm like, okay, so I call Adrian's library, museum, email, whatever. I did both. And I'm like, hey, do you have anything on the Page Fence Giants? Oh, we get calls on these guys all the time. So I'm thinking, okay, this is good. People want to know about this. Yeah, we have files on them. I'm like, okay, we're your championship team in 1896. It's a library. It's 3 stories. It's the old Carnegie Library. That's where the museum is now. Okay. So I'm going in there, and I meet these 2 people, and they're about my age. One guy's a retired gentleman. I'm like, hey, I'm here for the Page Fence Giants book. And they kind of, look down their noses at me like, oh, we've heard this before. I said, wait, so we get lots of people that want information, going to write a book, and then there's no good book. Well, I'm thinking, this is Adrian. They must have like volumes of stuff on a championship ball team. So they lead me down in the basement. I'm waiting for the light to come in and the angels to hum, and they're going to pull off these bound volumes. I'm going to be like wading through 10 feet of documentation. I'm like, this is going to be so exciting. I've stumbled upon a gold mine. All somebody has to do is tap into the resources that have not been harnessed. And they threw down a little folder with about 6 sheets of paper in it. Somebody had cut out 1895 newspaper articles, written on them. There was a picture in there, and then they had a copy of the Coiled Hustler, which I wouldn't name a newspaper that anymore, but the Page Fence Company, that was their newspaper they would send out. I'm like, this is it? Yep, that's it. I'm like, I couldn't get a newspaper article out of this thing. I'm not going to be able to do a book. So anyway, I got feedback from people saying, no, research these guys. So that's what I did. So I decided, wrongly, that if you won a national championship in black baseball in 1896, the Sporting News would have articles because it was the national paper of record for baseball from Mr. Spink from 1886. As a member of SABR, they're all scanned online. So I don't have to pay for them. So I'm like, there's got to be articles, there's probably going to be photos, there's going to be interviews. This is the mother lode that they don't have in Adrian. Well, there was also another magazine at the time called The Sporting Life. It's indexed. After 200 hours of reading, printing, cutting things out, I said to my wife, I don't think I can get 100 pages out of these guys. There's just nothing. There's nothing. The Sporting News had maybe 3 articles that you would call articles. And what I found out is that you had to figure out what minor league white team they were playing and then read their stories, or something called Caught on the Fly, which were single sentence, just facts. And it's really blurry and it's horribly scanned, the Sporting News is. So I spent about 200 hours literally reading these, everything from cover to cover. I kind of figure out, okay, I'll do horse racing. This is El Paso, Texas. I'm going to read that article. So I read this stuff. Then I come down the bottom, like the Page Fence Giants playing the Peoria Distillers, April 25, 26, 27. I'd write it down. So I ended up with 4 3-ring notebooks, 3 inches, of just photocopied stuff. Well, there wasn't much. So then I decided I better read all the Adrian newspapers. Well, if you know anything about newspapers from back in the day, most articles were like, unless it was like city council, were like 4 sentences long. But everything else was like 1 sentence. So there wasn't a sports section, so you'd have to read the Adrian Evening Telegram or the Adrian Daily Times and Expositor, kind of cover to cover from the local stuff. So I said, I know more stuff about Adrian people that I do not need to know about. And it was like, Mrs. McGillicuddy has a rutabaga and it's 5 pounds. Jimmy tripped and broke his tooth going to the church on Sunday. So I read all this stuff, but it also gave me a flavor of the town. I was able to pick up bits and pieces about the social aspects of the Page Fence Giants. So that's what I did. I know I spent way more time reading the Adrian papers. I read every edition, pretty much every edition, of the Adrian Daily, which became the Evening Telegram, and the Adrian Times and Expositor, from about March of 1894 to about June of 1899. I went down to Adrian 5 or 6 times. I went to the State of Michigan Library a bunch of times, and I took pictures with my phone. I just took notes. I started to piece together, sentence by sentence, a narrative as best I could on this ball team. So what's Findlay up here? Findlay, Ohio was up here because they were, well, a lot of teams claim to be amateur, but they weren't amateur. They'd be paid under the table. You'd get split of the gate receipts and things like this. And plus, gambling is widespread in baseball. They would laugh now that Pete Rose is not in the Hall of Fame because these guys would gamble all the time. They'd say, if you get a double, I'll pay you money. But Findlay is the home of like Marathon Oil, and they're huge in baseball. And a couple of these guys played in the major leagues. Harry Pastoris is up there, he's a pitcher. But Grant Johnson is from Findlay. He's about 18 years old in this photo. And Bud Fowler, who I'm actually starting a campaign with a couple of friends of mine to try to get him in the Baseball Hall of Fame as a pioneer. He's the first black professional baseball player in Lynn, Massachusetts in the 1870s. He never made it to the majors. That would be Mr. White and Fleetwood Walker were the first and second to play. But they travel all around. In 1894, Adrian, Michigan is baseball crazy, like a lot of towns are. And they have the Adrian Light Guard Armory team. And they announced that they want to play Findlay because they're probably going to destroy Findlay and they're going to sell out and get 2,000-3,000 people at the game and they'll make money. So they lure Findlay to Adrian and they promise them that they'll get some good games if they come to Adrian in the summer of 1894. Okay? This is actually George Wilson, and this is Gus Parsons. George Wilson plays on both the Page Fence Giants and the Adrian Demons, which we'll talk about. So what happens is, Findlay comes up to Adrian. Oh, I had myself here. And they destroy Adrian, not once but twice. It's like 19-2 and 10-0. Adrian is not even close. But they draw thousands of fans for these 2 days. Bud Fowler, the old gentleman I said on the end here, Bud Fowler had been famous for organizing ball teams, all black ball teams and integrated ball teams for 15 years. And he said, in my head, I want to do a traveling black baseball team based out of Findlay, Ohio. But if Adrian can guarantee me $500 profit, I will move the team in 1895 to Adrian, Michigan. That's how the team started. So Adrian only needed a month. They came up with Len Hawk, who was the ex-mayor, current postmaster, and a whiz on taxing. He was a follower of a guy named George out of England on this kind of bizarre taxing scheme. He was involved, and the Taylor brothers, who ran a hardware store. They combined with the two gentlemen I showed you, Grant Johnson and Bud Fowler, and they announced that the Page Fence Giants are going to be playing in Adrian in 1895. And who is Page? Page is a Civil War veteran farm boy. He lives outside of Adrian, 6 or 7 miles on a farm with his grandparents. His parents had died when he was younger. And he was with Sherman's March to the Sea. And he saw what happens to wooden fence posts. And when the Union comes through, they use them for kindling and planks and to fix stuff. And he knew that there was a market for fencing. So he and a younger cousin of his would farm during the day, and on the weekends and nights, they tried to make this giant loom that would weave fencing into squares, like kind of like waffle design, not sharp like barbed wire. That was invented by Joseph Glidden in 1873 because he didn't want to hurt the livestock. So Page kind of is a one-man, two-man inventing while he's farming, but by the 1890s, he is in Adrian and he employs about 150 people at a factory on the east side of town. And he's very well known for this very modern and creative marketing tool. We don't know the details because the company closed down, it was sold after his death right around World War I, but the Page Fence Company agrees to bankroll the team and they will take no profits, which is astounding. So they buy a train car. Now, right here, this is Gus Parsons, the Hotel Emery guy, business manager, and these are the Taylor brothers, Rolla and Holland. And this is a self-contained train car. And the reason they had the train car was because of segregation and issues between black and whites in the North. And so this train car is top of the line, and I kind of estimated by finding other articles about elaborate train cars in this time frame, that this train car was probably worth $30,000 in 1890 dollars. Now, to give you a concept, the average farmer with 40 or 80 acres was probably netting $350 to $500 a year. So you have a $30,000 train car that's carrying these black ball players around the Midwest. Getting back to reading, because the media was controlled by white owners and white reporters and white editors, it was very difficult to find information, even in Adrian, particularly after the first year on the ball team. There was only one biography on really any of the players, and that was George Wilson because he lived 6 miles away. But this is the description of the train car. By the way, if you're thinking this is a Pullman train car, this is a step above that. This is like the Cadillac. This has got leather seats and heating and cooling. And so this is the most elaborate description of the train car. And by the way, this was in one article. This was more elaborate than they ever wrote in one article about the Page Fence Giants, including the championship year. So those were some hurdles. But just to give you an idea of his train car, passing in on one end of the car at the right hand is a conveniently arranged lavatory, and just in front of you, a door opening into Manager Parsons' private office and stateroom. There are 2 berths and a table, and along the side of the apartment are seats upholstered in leather. Passing along through a narrow passageway, we come to a door that opens into the kitchen. Will Gaskin will be in charge of this room, which is fitted up with an acorn steel range and all the modern conveniences in the way of cooking utensils. Everything has its place on the shelves or in the handy cupboard in the corner of the room. Going through another door opening off the passageway, we find ourselves in a much larger apartment, which is dining, sitting, and sleeping room combined. At the end toward the kitchen is a handsome sideboard in which the silverware and chinaware are kept. There are 12 upholstered chairs. The berths, 20 in all, swing in toward the wall so they look like panels on the side of the car. The floor of the dining room is covered with a pleasing design, and the sitting room is carpeted with Brussels. Opening off the other end of the car are the closets, and in this part is also the heater. The fuel is carried in lockers under the car. Double windows prevent any dust from getting in and also keep out the cold and damp air more effectively. The name of this car is the Louis XVI, and joining Parsons, Gaskin, and other players are the Albert Carter, an Adrian native, and black man who will serve as the team's porter and barber. So the Page Fence Company outfitted this for all 4 years. And it's astounding to me because your number one employer in town, the Page Fence Company, is using as their number one tool to market their company a traveling ball team of black ball players, which I think today could be seen to be as a little risky, but back then it definitely was, I'm imagining. Here's Will Gaskin here. Here's Mrs. Parsons. They ended up divorcing, and there's Gus Parsons. And it says here, the baseball club, Page Woven Wire Fence Company, and then a bunch of little guys looking at the train car. And they rode in this for 4 years. And basically what they did was, Gus Parsons would telegraph, or they would make an appointment and basically say, what accommodations can the African American or black ball players get in your town? If they could eat, then they would get off the train car and go into town and eat. If they could sleep, then if they chose to, they could sleep in the local hotel in town. If they couldn't do one or the other, then this was all self-contained. They got their food there and they could sleep there. So they got around the Jim Crow laws of segregation in the North. And one of the things I find, particularly teaching high school students and even adults, is people have a tendency to think the segregation was cut off at the Mason-Dixon line. In the South, it was not. And depending upon your local custom from town to town, the treatment of the black ball players varied greatly across Michigan and other places. So they would just be on the back of a train car, the Michigan Central, Wabash, Lakeshore, Michigan Southern. They pull off to the siding. They kind of got the lay of the land. They'd go into town to eat or not. The first year, and this wasn't documented too much, they did like a Pied Piper marketing tool. They got red Monarch bicycles, and they had red firemen's hats and these wild uniforms, not their playing uniforms. This is their 1895 model, by the way. And they would ride bikes through town, and people would say, come on, come all, go to the fairgrounds and watch the ball team. And then they would proceed to completely destroy the local Yokels. This is supposedly them playing. I believe they're at bat. We don't know the date, the time, or the location. But I believe they're at bat, and there's a couple of guys on base. This is the only picture of the Page Fence Giants that we're aware of that exists of them playing, and we don't have any details. This is at the John Bell Park in Grand Rapids. So here's the Page Fence stuff all weaved together, and they sat on it. And so they would come to town, and they would ride their bike, and they would go to the local place, and then they would make money, and hopefully would sell fencing to the local farmers, and it was a nice marketing tool. The problem is, these are professional ball players. And a lot of the towns did not have professional ball players, or they would hire a ringer. You'd hire a pitcher and a catcher for $75 or $20 or $15, whatever it was. Well, some of these guys probably should have been in the major leagues, and so they're annihilating the local group. I mean, the Page Fence Giants, I came up with a 1-loss record in my book, but I think they were something like 500 wins and 100 losses, or 98 losses in 4 years. They beat people really, really badly. As a matter of fact, before the team was settled, because they got rid of some guys after the first couple of weeks, they had played the Cincinnati Reds. That was a major league team in Cincinnati. And the first game they got beat pretty soundly, and the local Cincinnati newspapers basically said the umpires ripped you guys off. The second game they played, they were leading halfway through the game 2-0. These are all major league ball players. So these were high-level players. I try to compare them to the Harlem Globetrotters in that the idea that you could kind of clown around while you played. When you bought the tickets for the Harlem Globetrotters, you expect that's part of the deal. They bring the Washington Generals in, and you know the Generals are going to get killed. Well, here, they would occasionally do things like cartwheel between bases on homers and break out singing and play shadow ball, because if they could read the crowd, if things were going to get a little sketchy here, getting back to the train car, like the Klan was in town, or something, they had to reduce the tension, particularly if they're going to be there for 2 or 3 games. You could not embarrass your hosts. So this was one of the dicey things that I had a hard time negotiating through, because they didn't really cover it, but some were quite adamant that the games were rigged against the Page Fence Giants when they lost. This is who would normally ump a game, the player from the other team that wasn't in the starting lineup. So let's put that dynamic. You're in the middle of nowhere, there's 12 black guys that show up, they're going to beat the local people that you've hired. Maybe that ball caught the corner for a strike, maybe it didn't. Maybe it was close at first, maybe it wasn't. And that's where I got a lot of the commentary about the communities from how the media covered baseball. Now, so when I would find out the Page Fence Giants are going to Kalamazoo, I would read the Kalamazoo papers a week or two ahead to see how they treated them and marketed them and referred to them. And then I would go to the local papers because I never found a master schedule. So there was nothing ever in the paper. So I had to piece together, oh, they're in Sheboygan, Wisconsin, they're in Oshkosh, they're in Chicago, they're going to Milwaukee, they're in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. So I had to kind of find those newspapers the best I could. But they played a lot of their games in Michigan. So one of the things that was kind of difficult to do was, how do I do this balancing act between the lack of media coverage and how people were portrayed at this time? And it was very difficult to find news about African Americans socially. They didn't even cover the black churches. There were 2 of them in Adrian. About once a month they would mention something about somebody gave a service, but every Friday they had the whole lineup of all the white churches in Adrian, like who was speaking and everything. So I had to take a lot of ball information from ball games to kind of weave this narrative. But I will say that 2 of the people that read my book at first, they were not baseball fans. And I don't think one was even a sports fan. And she told me that the best thing about my book was my preface. I'm like, oh, it's not really good because there's like 240 pages after my preface. She says, no, you have this line here, something like, this is not a book for only baseball nerds and stat heads, but it's a book about America at this time. And that's what I tried to tell the story. I'm a sociology teacher as well, so this is not like a recap of 4 years of games like you would see. It's kind of weaves this narrative in there. So the Page Fence Giants would break into song and whatever they could to reduce the tensions, and that's what they did for 4 years. They came to Kalamazoo, and Kalamazoo was interesting because they also, in 1895, they had a minor league team in the Michigan State League, along as did Adrian. Adrian's white ownership decided they were going to have 2 teams, the Page Fence Giants and the Adrian Demons. And the same gentleman, the Taylor brothers and Len Hawk, the mayor, they ran that team. This is just the Page Fence Giants, probably 1897 as well. It's the cover of my book. This is actually the Page Fence factory, which is kind of like being torn down in Adrian. It's on the far east side of town. And this is where Lawrence Park is. This is where they have all their school buses in Adrian. This is their DPW. This is where Lawrence Park was for 2 years. Most people don't know that, so I took a Google shot there. So these weren't elaborate places. And that's just where it says the ballpark. And this is advertising from about 1895 or 96. Fred Van Dyke's from Vandalia around here. He's down here on the left. That's, again, another advertisement for the Page Fence Giants. And then there was a movie. I'm in a movie. But anyway. So what happened was the Adrian Demons wanted to win the Michigan State League, so they hired 2 of the Page Fence Giants. George Wilson, a left-handed black pitcher, who's 19 or 20, and Vasco Graham, who's a catcher. Well, when they came to Kalamazoo, Kalamazoo didn't like the integrated team, and they protested. And they said they weren't going to play the Adrian Demons because they had black people on their team. So Kalamazoo's kind of in there protesting this. And the commissioner, a guy named Walter Mumby out of Corunna, says they have legal contracts, and if you would like to forfeit the game, you can do that. But I don't think you want to forfeit these games. And by the way, the National Association, which was the overriding group that monitored minor league baseball, has already approved the contract, so you can forfeit your little life away. So Kalamazoo didn't come out doing very well. They also played the Page Fence Giants, and on page 79, the Giants' uniforms were quite stinky and dirty, and they took them to a local laundromat in Kalamazoo, and they shrunk them all accidentally, and they couldn't use their uniforms, so the Page Fence Giants ownership was going to sue the laundromat. They said that only 12-year-old boys can fit into them now. Thank you, Kalamazoo. So anyway, it was also interesting that you could see the treatment of the media changed. Kalamazoo, at the beginning of playing, particularly Page Fence Giants, appeared to me to be a little dismissive, and then when they saw the ball players on the field became very complimentary, very praiseworthy of the ball players. And that was the case when you went from place to place. Interestingly enough, Adrian College was this really ultra-liberal community. They had Asa Mahan as the head of Adrian College, which is a United Methodist-based college. For any of you MIAA people here, I was at Albion Townie. I was not a Briton, but I was a Townie in Albion. So, and it was also United Methodist there. Asa Mahan came from Oberlin College, which pushed interracial diplomas in college and women. So he came to Adrian. The Underground Railroad stopped in Adrian. Laura Haviland, there's a huge statue of her. The South put a $3,000 bounty on her head for running the Underground Railroad. She's from the Adrian area, like a couple miles to the north. They were on one of the main railroad lines. And Adrian had a vibrant middle-class, black middle class. I went through all the census reports from 20, 30, 40, when it was known as Logan, all the way up to about 1900, and there was no black side of town in Adrian. They lived in all the wards, they ran businesses, there were interracial marriages, there was actually one black and white co-owner of a laundromat. So Adrian was very liberal. However, the newspaper coverage was very glorified towards the Giants until the white Adrian Demons in that minor league came up, and the coverage flipped. And they really focused on the Adrian Demons minor league team in 1895, even though the only local ball player was George Wilson, who was the black pitcher from Palmyra, that was on the Giants, the Page Fence Giants. He was with the Demons. At the end of the year, went back to the Giants. In June, when the Adrian Demons played the Page Fence Giants in Adrian, the majority of the fans wanted the minor league team to beat the black ball team, which tells you kind of the strength of race when the company that has hired the most people in your town, and they're basically the Chamber of Commerce on wheels for your factory, the locals want the white ball team with the two black players, Vasco Graham and George Wilson, to beat your local Page Fence Giants. Well, the Page Fence Giants annihilated the Adrian team. It was 20-10, and it was just the next game was even worse. And they had like 3,000 people show up in 2 days, and they made just oodles of money. But that was very striking that even in this town that supported African-American business, and they supported this team as a marketing tool, the racial card was definitely very evident in all of the coverage. And I found that as they went across the state, and you would see places, first of all, you could figure out whether the editor knew anything about baseball. Because they would make some comments about, well, they got 5 outs that inning. Well, they didn't get 5 outs. What are you talking about? You know? And others were very, very glowing. And so Manistee was very welcoming to the Page Fence Giants. Hudson, Michigan was. Traverse City was. Lansing, not so much. Jackson, not really. Defiance, Ohio, new. Hastings, Michigan was very unique. They had written in newspaper articles that they were known for not being friendly to black people. And what happened was, we don't have a picture of him, but Gus Brooks is this outfielder. He collapses during a game in Hastings in June of 1895, and they put him in a kind of a cart, and they take him back to the hotel, and they finish playing the game, and they go back, and they just thought he had like heat stroke, like had been overcome by the heat. Well, he had a heart problem, and he died. And he was like 27 years old. He's from like Southern Illinois, St. Louis, Missouri area. He's got no relatives. And so the Hastings Methodist Episcopal Church sent their minister over and their choir to sing at the bedside for the ball players. And the next day, the body was shipped back to Adrian, and Gus Brooks was buried. Well, if you read the articles, the Hastings papers like, see, we did a really nice job, doing this. I guess we're not that, racially bad community as people thought. And Adrian bragged about how they took care of Gus Brooks. Gus Brooks didn't even get a headstone until 2 years ago. We had found out that he had a headstone. He was marked in an unmarked grave, and some of us gave money, and there was a huge headstone. So even it was hard to kind of navigate how truthful was the media when you're reading these contemporary stories. And so that was a big hurdle for me to kind of juggle this. And I've been doing my own family tree research for like 35 or 40 years. If any of you try to do your family tree research, try to find out a woman's name after she gets married, her first name, because they're never, ever used again. They're always Mrs. E.J. Jackson, you know, Mrs. S.S. Smith. Even in some of the obituaries, they don't have her name. So if you think how women were treated in the media in the 1890s, now look at how African Americans would have been treated. It was very difficult to weave this story, which is why it took me hundreds and hundreds of hours to piece this together. So what happens is, in 1895, they make a bunch of money. The Adrian Demons, the white team with the 2 black ball players, they don't make that much money. They don't get reorganized. And the next year, the Page Fence Giants get a little bit coverage in the Adrian papers, and they win this series of ball games. And some people said it was a 12-game series, 15-game series, 16-game series, 17-game series, 19-game series, because the losing team always kept adding games to the series to try to catch up. So they ended up beating the Cuban ex-Giants. There were 2 teams called the Cuban Giants. None of the players are from Cuba. They were all black. And as I was speaking before, the code word Giants in many of the ball teams at this time meant that your ball players were black, other than the New York Giants in the major leagues. So that was a key. So the Cuban Giants, there was Cuban ex-Giants and Patriots Giants. So they played in South Bend and Adrian and Langsburg and Cairo, Michigan, and they played a series of games, and they win. They declare themselves the baseball champions of 1896 of Negro League Baseball, at which point the owner of the Cuban ex-Giants writes an editorial at to the Sporting News and says, well, you won the most games, you scored the most runs, but we had more hits, and all of our guys are really old, and all your guys are really young, and our guys all had Charlie horses and couldn't run, so you really out-youthed us. Okay, so this was kind of that was kind of the back and forth. I was like, nothing's changed from today, has it? Oh yeah, we were younger and they're older, whatever. In 1897, the team is back for a 3rd year. They keep most of the players. Most of the time, the roster was about 12 players. But they stopped really having much biography or any information about the ball players in the Adrian papers. And in 1898, they were again traveling. And I said they played probably about 140 to 160 games a year all over the Midwest and in Canada. And every year they won 80 to 90% of their games about. But one of the big questions I had from people in Adrian was, why did the team stop? They kept winning, they were making money, and the Page Fence Giants company was still backing them. They still had the train car. What changed? And what changed was several things. One was the Spanish-American War. That broke out, the sinking of the USS Maine, accidentally, was in February of 1898, and by April we're in war. Well, the Light Guard Armory was based in Adrian, and they had a company within a regiment of guys were shipping out. So it was war fever in the newspapers. Some of your young guys that were in the local Light Guard Armory were ball players, so there wasn't really, it was like war fever in the newspapers. It wasn't really baseball fever. So I think that gave the focus away from the Page Fence Giants as they were like training and getting ready to go. But the other thing was, and when I mentioned this to people, they didn't have any concept of this, but I'm pretty adamant about this, the Steel Trust. The Steel Trust was run by East Coast steel magnates, and they wanted to control all the manufacturing in the country if you use steel. So what they told J. Wallace Page was, you will buy the steel for your fencing from us at our price using our railroad tracks to ship it to you and back. Because the Page Fence Company took raw steel and they put it on the loom, and they didn't have their own plant. Well, at one point, they were something like 300 miles of fencing orders behind. And they were running 22 hours a day, 6 or 7 days a week, and they could not get the raw material. So as 1898 is rolling through, if you're J. Wallace Page, you're like, should I really be marketing a team for a product I can't make? And one of the things that I've talked to several black baseball experts is, it was very rare to have this level of funding for a black ball team that did not take the profits. This was all marketing. They didn't have taxes in, but they would write it off. But you still had to have the train car. They still employed the cook and the porter. They still had to pay Gus Parsons. who was doing business work, and then James Stevens, the advanced guy. So what happened was J. Wallace Page built a steel mill out in Menneson, Pennsylvania, to go head-to-head against the steel trusts. And then he had to figure out a way to get it shipped, and they were going to close the factory down. And there was a big panic that Adrian was going to lose their factory, and the railroad in town had announced that they were no longer going to fix the rail cars in Adrian. They moved all their stuff to Buffalo, New York. So the two top employers in the town, and we're talking probably maybe 1,000 workers between those two things, in a matter of a few months, you go from no war to local boys going to war to your top two employers possibly pulling out. So I think J. Wallace Page, he finally makes the steel plant and they kind of get around the steel trust. But I think after a while, it was like, I really can't have this marketing tool out here. It's costing me time and money on a product I may not be able to deliver. So at the end of 1898, all reports I saw that the team made money. They turned a profit, they could pay all their players. And then they were sold to a group of black kind of dandies and businessmen and well-to-do gentlemen in Chicago. And they moved almost all the players there and they became the Columbia Giants. Columbia was the name of the kind of the social drinking, card playing, cigar club for African Americans in Chicago. And they were based really near where Comiskey Park is on the south side, like 37th and Wentworth. That was their local field. And they played for a couple of years and then they kind of dispersed. In terms of the ball players' pay, your best pitcher got $100 usually. Your catcher got $75. Everybody else was $50 to $60 a month. So if you're playing April, May, June, July, August, September, and you're making $100, that's $600. I just said earlier that the average farmer was making about $500. And then you could play in Mexico, you could do barnstorming games, and many of the ball players had other jobs. They were porters and barbers. But Adrian, the Page Fence Company, hired some of the ball players in the wintertime to work in the factory. And so if you were on the Page Fence Giants, you were definitely, for the time you played, you were upper middle class. There's no doubt about it. Some of the players lived in Adrian in the off season. If they were at the factory, some of them, went back home. And then the Page Fence Giants just kind of went on their way to become the Columbia Giants. And so what happens is this barnstorming and this idea of ball players kind of dies out with African Americans because of a lawsuit that started in 1891 in Louisiana. It was called Plessy versus Ferguson, which is, if you know about Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas in 1954, that overturned Plessy versus Ferguson. And this is important because this happens during the Page Fence Giants time. Plessy versus Ferguson ruled that you could have separate but equal public facilities based on race. So you could have the black water fountain, the black waiting room at the train station, the black and swimming hole, and the white swimming hole. And the Page Fence Giants were still playing some interracial teams in 1896, 1897. But by 1898, the lawsuit had been kind of law of the land for 2 years. And I noticed kind of a change. That was kind of the end that there would be any opportunity for black ball players to play in the major leagues. For a couple other reasons as well. There was all this gentleman's agreement in 1887 that Cap Anson that came on. And interestingly enough, Cap Anson's real name is Adrian Constantine Anson because his dad lived in Adrian, Michigan, moved to Constantine, and then moved to Marshalltown, Iowa. So a guy that's helping to draw the color line in baseball has a connection to Adrian, Michigan, the Page Fence Giants. I thought that was kind of an odd acquaintance of history. So the Plessy versus Ferguson lawsuit basically says you can treat people differently, and that's when they still had the barnstorming teams, but I just didn't see it as important. And then in 1920, at the YMCA in Kansas City, Missouri, they start what is known as the Negro Leagues, which you may know with Buck O'Neill and Satchel Paige and Buck Leonard and Josh Gibson. And what I found is even in the Robert Peterson book, Only the Ball is White, there wasn't much recognition of the quality of the ball players because they were seen as kind of barnstorming. It wasn't real. There weren't league standings. You played minor league teams. You played local farmers. You played ragtag teams of players. And I found that was a huge divide between trying to talked about black baseball, because when I've gone to a couple black baseball conferences, people know kind of about the Page Fence Giants, but most of the people didn't. And when I explained to them, like, oh, that was before organized baseball, I'm like, well, wait a minute here. The American League started in 1901, the National League started in the 1890s. No, this was organized baseball. They had umpires and rules, but it was just interesting. So as I was trying to do research, I had to get over the hurdle of white media covering black players, Adrian being split on the local team in 1895, the Page Fence Giants, the fact that this was a barnstorming team, and the fact that they never had a schedule we could find. So that's kind of how I weave this narrative of what America was like in the 1890s, and said, okay, I'm going to write this book. And so I wrote this book, and then the other two I published were self-published, which all it means is that you pay somebody to print your book and you put whatever you want in it. You get an editor or not, you know, so I got this book, and I have a title, and I love this title, and I give them a title, and they're like, you can't use that title. It's like, oh, so there's like 4 things wrong with the title of 13 words, so they change it. Then I found out that they designed the cover of the book and the back cover of the book, which I didn't know that, but they could do that, and they set the price of the book, the retail price of the book. So I learned a lot. One of the other pitfalls was, obviously I'm not African American, and how would I deal with that component? I've talked to people that were concerned that that would be some sort of issue, or I wouldn't be able to navigate that. Well, one of my agreements with my publisher was I wanted that you get a peer review. That's when somebody who's an expert in that topic, whatever book you're reading, reads it to make sure you're doing things. And so I asked that somebody that was African American peer review the book. So I wasn't using terms or phrases that were clunky or inappropriate or downright offensive. I don't know who my peer review was, because they just named them number 1 and number 2. I know one was a white person, a male or female, and one was a black person. And I didn't really get any feedback negative from the African American person. But that was an issue. And I had somebody that was working in their head on a book, and they said, I just felt uncomfortable wading into the racial component of the book. And I said, well, I teach history, so that's kind of some of my job, to kind of wade through, you know, why women couldn't vote for 150 years, because we the people, the whole bit. And I grew up in Albion, which is a pretty integrated town. All through kindergarten through high school, I had integrated classes and ball teams and black teachers. So I kind of felt I had a comfort level. At least I kind of knew where I thought the red flags would be. So I've gotten a pretty good feedback on this. And then this is a movie. A guy named Mike Neal. He was an instructor out at Adrian College. He one day on a rainy day, he Googled Adrian, because he's from Canada, and came up with the Page Fence Giants. And there wasn't much. So the museum told him to call me, and he says, do you want to be in a movie? Well, first of all, nobody says no to that, right? Okay, yeah, no, I don't want to be in a movie, please. I'm having a bad hair day. So anyway, he's, you want to be in a movie. So I coach high school track and field. I'm like, I'm busy. I'm not driving to Adrian. It's like an hour and 10-minute drive. Whatever. He goes, well, I'll meet you. And he picked out a restaurant in Williamston. I'm like, okay. So we talked, and so I'm in this movie. You can get it on, I think you get it on Netflix for like $2. You can rent it or whatever. But so his story is about Bud Fowler. And Bud Fowler, right here, he was only with the Page Fence Giants the first 50 or 60 games in that first year. And then there's some sort of management crisis, and he leaves. And the Adrian papers don't cover it. I find this in the Owasso Times. They go chapter and verse on this. And so Bud Fowler then goes and does a bunch of other teams as well. Another thing, and just to kind of tell you, it really kind of made me feel good that even in the 1890s, where we kind of had this separated society, that you had people that really, really wanted to do things the right way. There was a game in a town in Indiana, they were like 3 or 4 games, and the Page Fence Giants were always just losing in the last bit. And so one night at the train, it appears it's a train car, an anonymous letter is signed by apparently some young adults, and they said, we're embarrassed of our town. You have been ripped off. The umpire's not going to let you win. There's a lot of betting taking place. We're totally embarrassed that we would treat people. You are guests. We have a local business guy who knows about baseball. he will work the game for free. He is waiting for you to get a hold of him tonight. If you go, we'll take care of the old umpire, and this guy will ump. That's what happened. They got rid of the other ump, and the Page Fence Giants win the other game. So that was, to me, kind of uplifting that somebody would go to those lengths, because the ball players weren't from that town, and he was in there at the time. But there were a lot of stories. They couldn't get some lodging in Flint, so an older couple opened their restaurant, said, come on in, and then Adrian Paper said, if you're ever in Flint, go to this restaurant, and that kind of stuff. So, I'm trying to balance all these different things: lack of media coverage, racist media coverage, how they dealt with women, females, blacks, how do we put this in 2018 concept, and don't go white guilt on this thing, but also don't ignore things that people did, both positive and negative, and try to add the context of the times. I think it's kind of important to understand. So that was all the stuff I was kind of juggling. Oh, by the way, tell about a baseball team that was really, really good. So that's kind of what I did. So I said, I'm getting more positive comments from people that are not baseball aficionados, because they kind of get a lay of the land. And so I'm comfortable that was kind of my goal, to tell a story of America about a black baseball team that was fighting integration and things at the time, that dealt with a lot of the communities that I grew up in and traveled. But that was it. But this thing was really drained me. I mean, it took me, I wrote it 4 times. I wrote the book 4 times. I keep changing it and changing it and changing it and write it all the way through. And then they said I had to do an index. I said, I'll just pay somebody to do the index. No, you got to do the index yourself. Okay, so you type in a word, and oh Lord, that took for days. So then I sent the book away in September of 2017, hoping to be out by Christmas. And then they're like, oh, it'll be out in the spring. And then I didn't hear from them, and I didn't hear from them. And somebody would say, oh, I saw it's going to be on Amazon live in March, and it wasn't then. And all of a sudden, they just got a hold of me in April and said, hey, your book's going to be at your house in 4 days. And I was really pleased with it, and really happy with it, is what I got back from it. And people want to criticize. They say, well, it's too late now. I can't change it. So, and most people don't come up to you and say, I don't like your work. So I kind of got the buffer there, 2 buffers. One, most people are polite and won't tell me that. Number 2 is I can't change it. So, people say, I'll send you some notes on a misspelling of a guy's name. I'm like, in 1890, everybody's name was misspelled. It was unbelievable. So that was it, and now I'm trying to get Bud Fowler in the Hall of Fame as a pioneer. I'm speaking in Albion on Saturday. I'm working at Fort Wayne. I've spoken in Detroit, Tecumseh, Hudson, and I've got more coming up. And the Michigan Notable Books was a really nice surprise. I think it was over 300 submissions of books. And so that was kind of out of the blue for the high school history teacher, track coach. Oh, by the way, I write books in my spare time, which it keeps me out of my wife's hair and my 3 kids. They like that too. So other than that, I've tried to kind of give a cross section of the ball players. There were great ball players: George Wilson and Bill Binga and James Patterson and Fred Van Dyke. But it's really hard because nobody really knows who the ball players are. So to spend a whole bunch of time giving you biographies on players that don't have any context until you read the book, I'm sure that if you're maybe a real big baseball fan, you might say, oh, you should have spent more time on the games. The games are in there because they help tell about the story, because that was the coverage. But it's a much broader book than that. I happen to like the 1890s. So anyway, that's my book on the Page Fence Giants. And I'm open for questions or whatever you like. Yes, sir.
Are there any family members of the players that you're aware of, or that have come forward, or could come forward because of the movie or the book or anything like that?
No. I get that question all the time, and that's a great question. My goal was I was going to be able, with my 40 years, I started like my junior year in high school, 40 years of family tree, I'm going to find about half the players, great grandkids, they're going to, oh, here's the uniform, here's the bat. I'm like, okay. Well, what I have found is that the lifestyle of ball players in the 1880s, 1890s, white or black, was very, very haphazard. I've written several Sabre biographies on ball players from this time. You'd be amazed how many people never married late and had no children. So that's one. Number 2 is, out of the 40 ball players, 42 ball players, I think I found on various box scores and line scores and rosters, I don't even know if I know where 10 of them died. because this comes into the coverage of whites and blacks. When Gus Brooks died in Hastings, Michigan, there is no death record. Well, if you know anything about it, in that time frame, you had to have a death record. I wrote them and I called them. Well, why do you think, and I'm not going to pick on Hastings here, but why do you think they have a death record? Because it was a black guy coming through town who cared. I mean, that's the bottom line. So one of the eye-opening things for me, and this kind of shook me to the core, and I was, I think I kind of know what's going on being a teacher and, growing pretty interracial mixed community. When I went to the Negro League baseball museum in Kansas City, Missouri, which is a great place, it's attached to the Jazz Museum. You should go if you ever get a chance to do that. You watch a movie before you kind of go in, like if you go to Pearl Harbor, you watch the whole Pearl Harbor thing. So when I'm watching this movie, and we're a bunch of baseball people, and I'll just kind of condense it. They just basically talked about the museum was in the epicenter of black culture in Kansas City at the time. So that it was like a 1980s interview with 3 elderly black women who were kind of prominent in the community. I think one was like the superintendent of school secretary, there was like a telephone operator, and so they knew people. Well, and so we're watching this, they're talking about Satchel Paige, which is not my era, but I'm just listening to it. It was really good. And one of the persons said something about, well, how did you find out the standings and when the ball players are in town? And they made some comments about a newspaper, a weekly newspaper that some black gentleman had put out. And they kind of made some, and I don't want to say derogatory comments, but they were kind of like, well, it was sometimes true if it was in there, but you kind of never knew about him, and he was kind of a man about town or whatever. And then somebody said, well then, why did you voice off the camera? Why did you buy this newspaper that you really didn't know if you could trust it? And the whole tone changed. And they all sat there and they said, because that's the only way you knew when black people died or got married or had kids, because the white papers didn't cover any of that. That was like wading in a wading pool and getting hit by a typhoon for me. I'm like, whoa. Number one is, I'd only written about 50 pages of my book. I was still researching. I said, this is going to be much more difficult than I thought, and I'm going to look for stuff that does not exist. I mean, think about not having your life validated in the community, like they don't put your obituary in there. So getting back to your comment, or your question is, I couldn't find death stories in newspapers. Now, I've gone to George Wilson's grave. He was the pitcher, the left-handed pitcher, would have been the majors. He died at the Kalamazoo Insane Asylum here in 1915. Apparently, untreated head injuries from getting hit with the ball. His was in the paper. Bud Fowler's, Grant Johnson was Charles Grant, but Fred Van Dyke from Vandalia, I got nothing. Joe Miller falls off the face of the earth. Billy Holland was an umpire in the 1920s in black baseball. Nobody knows how to Billy Holland. I probably found maybe 8 or 9 death dates and only a couple of stories. So that's frustrating because after I saw that movie, I'm like, I'm looking for stuff that's not there. It's just not out there. So that gave me kind of more of an emphasis to try to gather as much. So I'm still researching all the players. I have this huge filing cabinet, and I'm finding stuff, and he was in Nebraska, he was in Detroit. But there isn't any. In Adrian, they had always said that there were no local ball players on the patron startings from Adrian, which is false. Frank Waters was a high school kid who was hired in 1895 and 1896 to play for the team. Nobody knew that. The cook, Gaskin, had lived in Adrian and Jackson. He had played a couple games as a sub. I'm sure when you get off the train and you see the other team's not going to be very good, you're going to throw your cook out there. He won 1 game and lost a game. Albert Carter and Robert Henry were reporters, and Henry had played in 1 game as well, and he was from Adrian. So even the local lore of, well, these are just all guys we shipped in, other than George Wilson from 6 miles down the road, that wasn't accurate. I had very little response from the media and organizations in Adrian outside of the library and historical museum. I wrote the NAACP, I wrote the black churches in towns, and hey, and I didn't really hear anything back. So, yeah, that's my hope. Somebody says, hey, this is great-grandpa, and, the story's not going to change, so, they can still read it, but I've not gotten anything like, oh, I think I know. And here's another thing. There were several reincarnations in the 1920s of the Page Fence Giants. Some guy had gotten home, he said, my dad played against him. Well, your dad, he did not play against him. There was a team that basically, you could kind of steal things back. There wasn't trademark infringement. So in the 1920s, there was a team of the Page Fence Giants. They went around. Michigan and up north. But I haven't found anybody. And like Len Hock, the old mayor, I tracked down his kids. One was killed like in a car wreck. Len Hock committed suicide in a hotel room. Gus Parsons, the manager, no kids, divorced. Jim Stevens, the advance agent, no kids. Bud Fowler, no kids. George Wilson, never married, no kids. So I mean, everybody I could find, I'm just hoping that somebody, had a snippet of something. So I'm not giving up, but I also figured out after that first couple of months that my book was not going to be biographies of ball players. It had to be event-centered as opposed to individual-centered because they're not there. I mean, if that makes any sense. But yeah, I'm waiting for somebody to call and say, hey, I loved your book. So-and-so was my great something. I've got something. Because they printed 9,000 calendars of the ball players and 8x10 black and whites because they would mention they were tacked up around town. You'd think somebody in Adrian, the museum didn't have them, the library didn't have them. I went through everything they had. So there was enough stuff that was out there that, I need the guys in American Pickers to come stumble through some sort of file. But I tried, that was my goal, if I could get just one person that said, oh yeah, my grandfather, my great-grandfather. But I just had about 42 dead ends.
Yeah. Other than the posters, there weren't anything like a baseball card?
The baseball cards that were made in the 1990s by Ted Williams company. There was George Wilson and Bud Fowler, and I'm not sure the Bud Fowler one, I'm kind of wondering about that one, to be honest. No.
But back in those days, it didn't.
No, the Hannes Wagner ones, those were like in 1908, 1912. But again, what's the market for black ball players? They're just that wouldn't have been a market, and so I'm not aware of any. And believe me, because I was hoping for that too. No, nothing.
Were there any college baseball teams that were able to play, or did they play?
Frank Waters, who was a substitute pitcher, he pitched at Adrian College a couple times. They were integrated in the MIAA. Bill Binga, who is this guy, where's Bill? This is Bill right here. Bill Binga was actually hired by Olivet College in the beginning of the 1896 season to be their college baseball coach. I don't know, and my wife works there. I'm going to try to go to their archives this summer. I don't know if he coached any games. And James Patterson, is he in this picture? Patterson is, he's not in this picture. Patterson apparently is the first, he's the coach of the first high school baseball championship. 1907, Battle Creek High won the state title. They beat there's like 6 schools playing or something. But he was a black patrol officer for 30 or 40 years in Battle Creek, and he ends up he dies in an older age, and escaped. Guy was at Fort Custer and was acting odd, and they put him in the Battle Creek Sanatorium or whatever, and he broke out, and he attacked Patterson and a couple other police officers. He was injured and died a few days later. And Patterson's house is still standing. I want to kind of go to that. But he's also friends with Jack Johnson, the famous boxer.
But the Giants themselves didn't play college team.
Yeah, they did. They played Michigan. They played Beloit College. Yeah, they killed the teams. They were in close. They killed the college teams. Yeah. They played University of Madison. Madison thought they were going to win. They whitewashed them. Yeah, these guys were pro. They were all pros first of all, and several of them should have been in the major leagues. If I'm not going to say all of them because I don't know, but Bud Fowler in 1889 played for Greenville in a minor league team, and there were 31 players in that league that made the majors. He was third in batting, batted over 300, didn't make it. So now I'm not saying he's going to be a superstar, should be in the Hall of Fame, but Comiskey said he would have offered the Page Fence Giants $50,000 for the rights to sign George Wilson as a 20-some-year-old to play, but he said he's black. So you're talking, $50,000 is an astronomical sum. Al Kaline was signed for what, $20,000 in the 1950s as a bonus baby? So so some of these guys were definitely major league superstar calibers. Others would have made the majors, and others, probably like everybody else, would have been middling high minors. But yeah, they played college teams. But again, you're saying, do you really want to write about your local college, thought they're going to win, and they get annihilated by these black guys who don't know, so that was very hard, but they did play some teams. Yes, sir.
First, a belated but heartfelt welcome to Kalamazoo. We're glad that you're here.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
And second, congratulations on your work. It's most impressive.
Yeah, this kind of
And third,
blew my mind.
so here's an uncomfortable question, but you courageously have alluded to it already yourself. You know, I haven't read every book on black baseball,
Right.
but it seems like it's almost exclusively told by white historians.
Yep.
And
Yep.
since you're active in Sabre, and I
Mhm.
assume in the Negro Leagues committees,
Mm-hmm.
talk about that. Do you see that changing? Because, you know, that's not the case for the cinema. That's not the case for jazz or black theater. So I know it's a huge question, but just a little bit.
Well, when I have spoken, I've spoken several times to audiences that were mixed race. And one of them, we showed the movie. So I'm in the back. I want to see people's reactions from the side. Are they nodding at the right time? And I was very, maybe nervous is appropriate. I didn't know in front of a black-white audience if I said something that was going to come out inappropriate or standoffish or arrogant or whatever. And I was getting the feedback that I wanted. And when I spoke to at several different places, African Americans, they were very thankful that somebody had written this book and said I had done things right and that kind of stuff. In terms of a larger picture, when Robert Peterson wrote his book in about 1971, Only Ball Was White, he was the first guy to do this. And he apparently spoke at a Jerry Malloy Negro conference in the 80s or something. They taped it. Well, 2 years ago in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania was the Jerry Malloy Negro Conference of black baseball fans and experts. They played the tape again, and they brought his widow in. She was in the late 90s. She'd since passed away. And her two kids were probably my age. And so the audience was several hundred people, I would say probably, I don't know, it was 50-50 black, white, but a large African-American population. And what I got from the comments afterward was that community was so thankful somebody validated the lives of their ancestors. And it wasn't ragtag baseball, and it wasn't a bunch of guys drinking and boozing and carousing. And I was struck, I won't say who the person is, but there was a gentleman whose father had owned one of the teams of the Negro Leagues. And he was in tears. I think he's lower than me, and he stood up and he said, "You don't understand this. My dad told these stories." And we're like, "Well, we don't find them in the books. There's no encyclopedia. Who are these players?" Well, Robert Peterson writes this book. He's got photos. And the black community would tell him, "Hey, call this guy in Charleston, so-and-so, call this guy." And he got cooperation. And it was very emotional that, for me, just watching this, because it said that the majority has validated the experience of a group of Americans that have been ignored. So, you know, in terms of that, I didn't have anybody say to me, this is a story that needs to be written by somebody black or a person of color, Cuban or something like that. And I said, well, it's a story for 120 years, nobody's written about it. I'm going to do this. If you don't like it, you can kind of critique me or do your own. But I kind of approach it. This is a story of America that happens to include black people and white people. And I don't know if that is something that I'm consciously kind of looked at that, but I've not got any pushback or blowback. But the one thing I look at is how many baseball fans do you have under the age of 40 of any color? There aren't a lot. 25% of the majors last year was Latino Hispanic. 8%, 6% were black, African American, the rest were white. So my deal is, baseball integrated before the military. Baseball pushed the envelope, So to me, this is like a civil rights story that happens to include a sport called baseball. So that's how I approached it and just said, hey, I'm going to write this story. But I talked to and emailed most of the people I talked with in the early stages were African Americans. I just said, hey, are you doing a book on this? Because you are, I'll step back and do something else. Or is this something that, no, do it. So you kind of get support. And I think, I looked at this too from the teaching standpoint. When I teach women's rights, I start with the Seneca Falls Convention in New York in 1848 with Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Susan B. Anthony's not even in the program yet. She's like 4 years later. And we talk about the Declaration of Rights and Sentiments, and Frederick Douglass was at the meeting. And we talk about this, and then we'll talk about the 1970s and things like that, equal rights failure, amendment, and stuff like that. But I think if you try to do justice to the actual story, I think people like that as opposed to, oh, it must have been Susan B. Anthony. If one more kid tells me the first person to run for president was a female, was Hillary Clinton, I was going to jump over my desk. I'm like, oh, no, it was that Palin from, Alaska. No, she was vice president. What about Geraldine Ferraro? Who? I said, okay, here's the clicker. Who was it? Shirley Chisholm, 1972 New York teacher. Okay, so to me, when you say that, you have some credibility. So when my book is all footnoted, it's all footnoted. So I even said to people, if you think this is, go back and check this stuff. So to me, I don't know if it was being naive, arrogant, stupid, trusting, a combination of all, but I was just like, I'm gonna write this great story that needs to be told about America, and I'm gonna do it. And there you go. And before I was a teacher, I was an investigative news reporter, so I'm used to kind of like, we're going to sue you and that kind of stuff, like, you don't do this or you ruin my political. That doesn't raise my blood pressure. So I kind of waded into this. I think I had my eyes wide open, but I'm also like, look, I got to juggle a bunch of balls to cover as many bases as I can. And I haven't gotten any pushback from this so far. But that was a concern. It was a concern. I don't know if that answered your question or touched upon it. Okay, thank you for asking that. Yes, ma'am.
Have you found any evidence that the Patriots Giants played in your hometown of Albion?
Yes, and I stumbled upon this. My aunt, who is in her about 80, my dad's sister, I said, they played in Albion in I think it was 97. Nobody mowed the field because it was, people were complaining in the newspaper. And I said, I'm not quite sure where they played, but I think they played around, we have a thing called Victory Park. It was in honor of the soldiers and it was a WPA project. So my aunt, who's also, we do family tree, she says, where did they play? I said, they played at the race track on the infield. She says, yep. I said, well, how would you know? She's like, I said, it was the Fairgrounds. She said, yeah. You know where Uncle Vern and I used to live along the river? Yeah. She goes, what's the name of the road? I go, Fairlane. She says, yep, that's where they played. Because she said when they did the core samples for the earth that there would be a high content of something because for 50 years the animals peed there, the racehorses and the whole bit. And she said we would find, so I'm like, you're kidding me. So where I grew up, when I go to my aunt and uncle's house, and because my cousins are all the same age as us, their yard, it's still there today. Matter of fact, it's owned by an African-American gentleman who came to my talk and I said, I don't know you, but I'm gonna creep you out. That's where they played, in your yard. So yeah, they played. They played one game there and the Patriots Giants won. And so that's kind of cool to find out that in my family for 30 years that my aunt and uncle lived there, that's where the game was played. So that's something you really can't make up. I mean, I guess you could if you weren't in politics, you could, but that's actually a true story. But the Fairlane Drive, I'm like, oh wow. So yeah. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
What's your next book?
Ooh, I don't know. This took a lot out of me because I would write after coaching and teaching and during spring breaks, and it took a lot, and I'm not a young pup anymore. I don't know. I think I have some really interesting stories about Williamston that are kind of far-reaching, that would have a market outside of Williamston. I've thought about that. I've done some research. I've been kind of approached, not official, not by a publisher, but like, hey, are you going to do some more black baseball or baseball from the 1890s, like minor league baseball in Michigan? Because I spent hours researching that. I don't know if I want to go in that direction, but writing a book is hard. And it takes a lot of time. And like you can't name your chapter titles. They tell you got to change them. I had to rewrite like 6 chapters. They said, okay, you got to put these 2 together because they're too short. The title wasn't mine. So there's a lot of it you kind of give up. And it was really hard, but I'm working teacher's hours. I mean, the summer we're off, but we're doing a lot of stuff. And so I don't know. And I don't want to be like who's the one that wrote the one book with Truman Capote's help, and she wrote The Watchmen with,
Harper Lee.
Harper Lee, thank you, yeah, you wrote the one book and then you're a recluse for 60 years because you maybe didn't, I don't know. So I kind of feel that pressure, like, do I need to go into a sports genre, a racial genre? Do I want to do something differently? And I don't, make enough money to quit my day job, so there's not anything like, I'm like Woodward or Bernstein or anything like that. Though I wanted to be that in high school, I was a reporter. I don't know, but I have people who like, oh, you write books, and then it comes out in the Free Press, it's a Michigan Notable book, it's not like, yes, I write books. I can do kind of that thing, as opposed to, yeah, I self-publish books. But this one was done by a publisher, so I don't know. I'm intrigued by a lot of things, so I don't know. I don't know. I'm sure when I start bugging my wife, she'll ask me, like, are you gonna write another book? Okay. Then the dog will jump on me, so I don't know. We'll see. I don't know. This was done, I said, September of 2017. It came out in April of 2018, and I've been giving speeches. I was texting Fort Wayne yesterday for a thing, and Detroit before people started coming in, and I got track starting in a month. I got 125 kids, boys and girls. I'm teaching and all that stuff, mentoring and all that. So I don't know, but I'm kind of a spaz head, so I can't sit still.
Well, it's wonderful that it's a notable book. That's a big deal.
Yeah, I think it is. But I just kind of went in like, okay, and then I get this email in December, and they say you can't tell anybody for like a month. So I told my wife, and that was about it. And then it comes out in the paper, then all of a sudden people are like getting a hold of you, and hey, can you do this stuff? It's like, okay. And I was going to teach today, but we had a snow day, so I could get down here. But normally we'd ice all over the place in mid-Michigan. And so I spoke Saturday, Wednesday, and Saturday. Then I'm going to Flint for a luncheon at the end of this month, and then I think Fort Wayne early March. So it's hard. I mean, just kind of, plus I talk all day anyway. I'm sure my kids, I do book work some days, but I talk. So I don't know. That's, again, a 10-second question, a 5-minute answer. So. Yes, ma'am.
Well, please come back and tell us about your next book, whatever it might be.
Okay, I'll put that on. Yeah, I've had a couple people say, oh, that's good, come back and talk. I'm like, okay, so, yeah, I'll try to do that. Because to me as a teacher, it's just an educational tool for me. I really like speaking about it. People say, well, how many people are going to be here? I'm like, well, no, the difference is you guys and gals all showed up under your free will, and all the kids in my class were there because the state of Michigan tells them they have to be there. So the feedback sometimes is, the same, sometimes a little bit different. But I'm just pleased that people are interested, and this is something that maybe just intrigues them. So just a little plug, my book's by McFarland Publishing out of North Carolina. There's a flyer if you kind of don't know if you're going to do it. Okay, the list price is $39.95, but when I speak, I cut $10 off. So it's $29.95, so it's $20, then I gotta pay sales tax. So I'm not gonna be the guy that gets hauled into chains because I didn't pay my sales tax. So it's $32, and I'll sign it and note it, and I have them back there. If that's something you wanna do, that's fine. My business card is there. If you want follow-up questions, that's my personal email. Again, there's a flyer. You say, well, I'm not really sure. You can buy it from the publisher. You'll be paying $10 more, so you might wanna do that now. I take cash or check. But again, I'm not gonna be offended. If you don't do that, but I did offer that, and that's part of the deal coming down here. So other than that, I think that's probably it. Again, thank you for coming out on a night, but the Pistons and the Red Wings aren't really any good this year, so you really didn't miss anything. And the Super Bowl's over, and the Lions missed that again. So as we know. So thank you very much. I appreciate it.